Little girl fixes private jet as a joke. CEO stops cold at his pilot wing necklace. What would you do if your private jet, worth more than some entire neighborhoods, suddenly refused to leave the tarmac on the very morning you were supposed to close the most important business deal of your career? That was the question Vincent Blackwood found himself asking as he stared at the sleek, grounded machine in front of him. The Gulfstream G650 sat motionless in the biting Montana cold, silent and uncooperative like a spoiled thoroughbred refusing to race. It was more than a jet to Vincent. It was his mobile command center, his refuge in the sky, a symbol of the empire he'd built over 20 tireless years. And now, as sunrise bled over the hangar roof and the first hints of snowfall began whispering against the windows, it was also his most expensive problem. Clearwater Regional Airport, a humble airstrip nestled against snow-capped ridges, wasn't supposed to host the kind of high-stakes drama usually reserved for Wall Street boardrooms. But that morning it did. 4 veteran mechanics had been working on Vincent's jet since before dawn. Systems had been checked, panels opened, circuit paths tested, retested and tested again. Every manual had been referenced, every possible error code had been chased down, and yet the issue remained, a total loss of navigational power, unexplained and unresolved. The jet wouldn't fly, and no one could tell him why. Vincent, layered in a tailored wool coat over a custom Italian suit, paced outside Hangar 7 like a caged executive. Every few steps he stopped to glance at his watch, then at the hangar doors, then at his phone, where messages from his assistant Marcus stacked up like digital panic attacks. "Sir, we need a backup plan." "Sir, the Chicago team is asking for confirmation." "Sir, your window is closing." But Vincent knew there was no backup plan. The Chicago deal was delicate. 17 months of negotiations, 7 rounds of legal review, and at least 4 competitors waiting for him to stumble. If he didn't show up in person by 2:30 p.m., everything would unravel: his reputation, his leverage, maybe even his company. Inside the hangar, Bobby Knight, the lead mechanic with 25 years of grease under his nails and not much patience for suits, emerged from beneath the jet's nose with a grim expression. "Still nothing, Mr. Blackwood," he muttered, rubbing his palms on a stained rag. "We've gone through every system 3 times. Everything looks perfect. That's the problem." Vincent didn't respond right away. He just stared at Bobby like he was a malfunctioning part himself, something Vincent might rip out and replace if he could. Perfect on paper didn't get him to Chicago. Perfect on paper didn't save multi-million-dollar contracts. He ran a company built on certainty, and this grounded beast was a crack in the armor he couldn't afford. From behind the landing gear, Tommy Rodriguez peeked out, a young apprentice with oil-streaked cheeks and nervous hands that fidgeted with his tools like they might magically solve everything if he just touched them the right way. "Maybe we should call Denver," Tommy offered hesitantly. "There's a guy there who specializes in this model. Maybe he could fly in." "Too late," Vincent snapped. "Even if he flew a Miracle in his carry-on, we'd still miss the meeting." He turned away and gritted his teeth so hard his jaw clicked. The engines were fine, power was flowing. But the central nav computer, the one system that made long-distance flight possible, remained stubbornly offline, and nobody could tell him why. The hangar was cold, too cold. Vincent's breath fogged the air in tight bursts. His polished shoes clicked sharply on the concrete as he moved to the side of the building, his frustration boiling over into the kind of restless energy that made subordinates nervous. He wasn't just losing time, he was losing control. Ground crews buzzed outside with routine efficiency, oblivious to the crisis inside. A fuel truck rolled past. The driver gave a friendly nod, but Vincent didn't even notice. He was already dialing Marcus again, barking orders, demanding solutions that didn't exist. And then, right as he raised his phone for another call he already knew would be useless, something strange happened. A soft, curious voice floated through the cavernous hangar. "I can fix your plane, mister." At first he thought he imagined it. He turned slowly, his brow furrowed, expecting to see another mechanic. Instead he saw her. She was small. So small, she barely reached the height of the engine intake. Her jacket was worn thin at the elbows. the denim washed pale and patched by hand. Her shoes, if you could still call them that, were wrapped in duct tape at the toes, the soles nearly peeling off. A tangle of hair framed her young face, and in one hand she held a sketchbook. Not a toy, not a coloring book, a real one, with thick pages smudged by graphite and grease. Around her neck hung a silver chain, the pendant tucked beneath her collar but glinting faintly in the hangar lights. She looked absurd there, standing next to a $65 million aircraft, like a child who'd wandered out of a storybook and into a nightmare of grown-up consequences. Vincent stared. Bobby blinked in disbelief. Even Tommy forgot to breathe for a second. The silence that followed her words was deafening. "What did you say?" Bobby asked, crouching to her level. "I can fix it," she repeated. Not louder, not softer, just sure, calm, absolute, like she wasn't making a joke, like this wasn't impossible. And as they all stood there, frozen in the surreal moment of a child offering to rescue a business empire, none of them could have guessed just how right she was. Because sometimes the solution doesn't come dressed in a lab coat or holding a toolbox. Sometimes it shows up in patched sneakers, clutching a sketchbook, and wearing a pair of pilot wings that carry more meaning than anyone in that hangar could yet understand. Bobby Knight hadn't moved yet, neither had Vincent. The girl's words still hung in the cold air like they needed time to settle. "I can fix your plane, mister." That wasn't something you heard from an 8-year-old. Not about bicycles, let alone a multi-million-dollar jet sitting dead on the runway. She stood there with her sketchbook held tight to her chest, looking up at men who towered over her, and somehow seemed like she was the only one not out of place. No fidgeting, no nervous glances, just stillness and certainty. Tommy chuckled awkwardly, trying to shake off the tension. "She's probably seen a few YouTube videos," he muttered. Bobby gave him a sideways glance but didn't reply. Something about the girl's voice had landed differently. Not like a joke, not even like a wild guess. It was too precise, too clear. Still, grown men don't hand over aircraft diagnostics to kids in patched-up denim jackets, not unless they've lost their minds or everything else has failed. And everything else had failed. Vincent's phone buzzed again in his pocket, but he didn't answer this time. Instead, his eyes narrowed on the girl as she walked slowly toward the aircraft. Not with the wide-eyed curiosity of a child sneaking a closer look, but with a deliberate stride, like she already knew what she needed to see. Her shoes scraped softly on the hangar floor, one duct-taped sole catching on the edge of a cord as she stepped around it without looking down. She didn't ask for permission. She simply stopped in front of the open nose panel and tilted her head slightly, listening. "You checked the main relay in C7?" she asked, still not looking at anyone. Her voice was calm, almost bored, like she was pointing out a missed page in a math test. "It's not fully engaged, probably stuck halfway. That's why you're losing clean power to the nav computer. It's not the board, not the software. It's a dirty mechanical fault." Silence, heavy and immediate. Bobby's hands froze on the rag he was twisting. Tommy blinked. Vincent tilted his head slightly, his mind trying to reconcile what he'd just heard with what was standing in front of him. She hadn't guessed. She hadn't hesitated. She knew. She had used the kind of language you didn't hear unless you lived in schematics. Junction box C7, secondary relay, partial engagement, clean power drop. Those weren't words you found in bedtime stories. Bobby slowly walked toward the open panel, peered inside, then looked back at the girl. "What makes you think that, sweetheart?" The girl finally looked up, meeting his eyes. "Because I can hear it," she said simply. "It's not powering clean. You can hear the difference. It's skipping every few seconds. You hear a small stutter in the line current. It's rhythmic, not random. If you had the right equipment, you'd see the drop on the scope. But if you don't have the right equipment, you can still hear it, if you know what to listen for." Tommy mouthed something silently. Vincent felt his pulse quicken, not from fear, but from something he hadn't felt in years, uncertainty laced with awe. It was like watching someone speak in tongues. Except it wasn't nonsense, it made perfect sense. And that was the most disturbing part. Bobby looked to Tommy. "Grab the scope," he said, voice low but firm. Tommy hesitated, glancing at Vincent, then nodded and darted toward the workbench. The girl stood quietly, watching, the wind outside beginning to push a light dusting of snow across the edge of the open hangar. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't proud, she was just waiting for them to catch up. Tommy returned with the diagnostic scope and carefully hooked it up to the relay panel. Bobby steadied the connections, then flicked on the display. A few lines popped onto the screen, and then the pattern settled. Every 6 seconds, a visible voltage dip. Small, subtle, but absolutely there. Bobby's jaw clenched. "She's right," he muttered. "Partial power drop. Looks like the relay's not seating properly." "Could that cause total nav failure?" Vincent asked, stepping closer. "With enough noise in the power delivery?" "Yeah," Bobby replied. "It could confuse the whole system. The backup might think the main's still running and refuse to take over. It's rare, but yeah, it checks out." They all turned slowly toward the girl. She didn't react. She simply took a step back, folded her sketchbook under one arm, and said, "You'll need a new relay, but if you don't have one, you can modify a standard connector if you're careful. Just match the voltage profile. Don't force it." Then, with a shrug so small it was almost unnoticeable, she added, "It's not hard. My mama taught me." And there it was again, those words tucked in like an afterthought. My mama taught me. Like it explained everything. Like it should explain everything. Vincent stared at her, trying to piece together the implications. Who was this girl? Why did she know these things? And how had she just done what 4 certified professionals could not? He glanced down at the silver chain around her neck. The pendant had slipped into view, not a trinket, not a toy. It was a pair of real pilot's wings, not the plastic kind kids got in souvenir shops. These were heavy, authentic, the kind that were earned, not given. And for reasons he couldn't yet name, Vincent felt something stir deep in his memory, something about those wings, something that didn't make sense. But right now, the only thing that mattered was that the problem had been identified, not by machines, not by experts, by an 8-year-old girl in worn-out shoes who shouldn't have even known what a junction box was. And the strangest part? She didn't seem surprised that she was right. Bobby Knight held the offending relay in his hand like it was a fragment of a crime scene. Small, no larger than a matchbox, its corroded pins and scorched contacts didn't look like much, certainly not enough to ground a $65 million aircraft or derail a career-defining business deal, but that's exactly what it had done. He turned it over slowly, inspecting the oxidized edges, and gave a soft grunt of disbelief. "A $37 part," he said under his breath. "This tiny piece of junk brought down a jet that cost more than most hospitals." He glanced at Tommy, who stood wide-eyed next to the workbench, and then at Mia, who remained by her milk crate seat, sketchbook tucked under one arm, eyes bright but unreadable. Vincent took a step forward, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his overcoat. His voice was low, controlled. "How long to replace it?" Bobby let out a slow breath, the kind you exhale when you already know the answer is bad. "That's the problem. This isn't something you can just grab off a shelf. It's a specialized relay unit, specific to Gulfstream's nav suite. We don't keep spares in stock because they almost never fail. I'll have to order it straight from the manufacturer. Even with priority shipping, we're looking at 48 hours minimum." Vincent didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at the dead relay, then at his aircraft, then at the cold Montana sky that was starting to darken with gathering snow. 2 days. He had 2 hours. And somewhere in a Chicago boardroom, lawyers were already circling the deal he'd spent the last year and a half building brick by brick. His breath grew shallow. His throat tightened. Failure wasn't just knocking at the door. It was halfway down the hall. His phone buzzed. Marcus again. Vincent didn't answer. Not yet. He turned instead toward Mia, who hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. "You said we could modify a different one," he said carefully. "How?" Mia blinked slowly, like she was shifting gears in her mind. Then she stood, walked calmly to the nearest workbench, and pointed at a tray of assorted components. "You have other relays," she said. "Not identical, but similar enough. The current specs have to match voltage, resistance, capacitance. The shape doesn't matter as much. What matters is what it does. Most people forget that. Bobby raised an eyebrow, curious despite himself. Even if we find a match electrically, the connectors won't fit. These systems are sealed, military-grade tolerances. They can be adapted, Mia replied without hesitation. You cut off the housing from the bad one, clean the leads, and marry them to the new relay's internals. You'll have to resolder the connections, maybe use epoxy to seat the shell so it won't rattle during turbulence. But if you're careful with the pin alignment, it'll work. Just don't reverse anything. If you cross pin 4 and pin 7, you'll short the whole nav bus. It was like listening to a technician in a child's body. Vincent exchanged a glance with Bobby, who was now rubbing his chin with the rag still in his hand, grease streaking his beard. She's not wrong, Bobby said slowly, reluctantly. It's risky. I've seen field adaptations like that before, but it's not common practice. FAA wouldn't exactly cheer us on. Would it fly? Vincent asked. If we do it right, Bobby answered. Yeah, it'd fly. Tommy leaned forward, hesitating. But who's going to do it? That's not the kind of mod you bang together with duct tape and hope for the best. Mia pointed to the relay bin again. Model 4A7 should work. It's a 28-volt unit with stable, low-resistance switching. You just need to adapt the bracket and swap the housing. The rest matches. Bobby moved to the bin, pulled the part, and examined it with a skeptical squint. It looked plausible. He tested it against the old relay with a voltmeter. The numbers came back close enough that his skepticism started to waver. Vincent stepped closer to Mia, lowering his voice just enough so only she could hear. Where did you learn all this? She touched her necklace, the silver wings catching the light as she answered quietly. My mama taught me. She used to say airplanes want to fly. Sometimes they just need help remembering how. Something about the way she said it stopped Vincent cold. There was no ego in her words, no sense of pride, just certainty and memory. Like she wasn't showing off, she was honoring something, someone. And suddenly, this wasn't just about fixing a plane. It was about something deeper, something personal. Mia walked over to the workbench, flipped open her sketchbook and started drawing. Fast, efficient lines, no hesitation. Within minutes, she'd diagrammed the new relay assembly, labeling each pin, each connection, showing exactly where to cut, where to solder, and how to seat the part inside the Gulfstream systems. Bobby peered over her shoulder. This is clean. Better than half the field repair instructions I've seen. Girl, how do you know this? I listen, she said. Engines talk, systems hum. Everything makes a sound when it's working right. You just have to know which sounds matter. Tommy walked over, quietly impressed. This feels nuts, he said, but it also feels like it could work. Vincent looked at the growing snowfall outside the hangar doors, looked at the ticking time on his watch, looked back at the sketch. How long would this take? Mia paused for a second. With the right tools and help, 2 hours, maybe less. If Mr. Knight does the soldering and Tommy pulls the parts, I can guide the rest. It wasn't just her confidence that struck Vincent. It was the absence of doubt, no bravado, no uncertainty. She believed this would work, not because she wanted it to, but because she knew it could. He glanced back at Bobby, who was already laying out the precision tools like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. Vincent took a deep breath, then nodded. Then, let's do it. If you say this can fly, I'm trusting you. Mia didn't smile. She simply picked up her pencil again and said, Then we better hurry. The storm's going to get worse before it clears. And just like that, the hangar transformed, from a place of failure and frozen plans to a workshop of motion and possibility, all because a little girl with duct-taped sneakers and silver wings around her neck had pointed to the one problem no one else could see. The buzz of movement inside the hangar began to build as Bobby and Tommy gathered the tools and parts Mia had pointed out, their earlier skepticism replaced by a strange, quiet urgency. Vincent watched the scene unfold from the edge of the workbench, arms crossed, mind still trying to piece together what he was seeing. It was surreal, a boardroom crisis being dismantled in real time by an 8-year-old child with grease under her fingernails and a mind sharper than most of the engineers on his payroll. But what struck him now, even more than her technical knowledge, was her demeanor. She wasn't wide-eyed or giddy. She wasn't proud. She wasn't even seeking approval. She was just doing what she clearly believed needed to be done, with the kind of stillness and discipline that didn't belong to children, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. The pendant around her neck glinted again as she leaned over the workbench, tapping her pencil against the relay diagram she was drawing. It looked like a pair of wings, not stylized or decorative, but solid, shaped with precision, aged with time. Vincent stared at it for a moment, longer than he meant to. It wasn't until Ray Green, the airport's operations manager, walked through the hangar door and stopped mid-step that the significance of that necklace began to unfurl. "Well, I'll be," Ray said with a smile that slowly turned into a look of disbelief, "if it isn't our little airport mascot. Haven't seen you around in a while, sweetheart." Vincent turned sharply. "You know her?" Ray nodded, brushing snow off her coat. "Everyone here does. Mia Richardson. Her grandma, Janet, brings her by most weekends. This kid's been hanging around hangars since she was old enough to stand. Got more brains than half the guys I've worked with. You put an engine near her, and she'll tell you what it ate for breakfast." Mia looked up at Ray and gave a small, polite smile. "Hi, Miss Ray." "I heard about what you did with old Peterson's crop duster last month," Ray added. "Word got around fast. They said you figured out a carburetor problem that had him grounded for weeks." Tommy paused mid-reach for a soldering iron. "Wait, that was her? The gasket issue?" Ray grinned. "Yup, Bill Peterson was going nuts thinking it was an ignition coil. Mia here listens to his engine for 2 minutes and says the float bowl gasket's swelling at altitude from temperature changes. He replaces it for $40 and boom, problem solved. She's got her mama's ear." That last sentence made Vincent stiffen. He turned slowly toward Ray. "Her mother's ear?" Ray's smile faltered. "Yeah, Sarah Richardson, one of the best pilots this airport's ever seen. Air Force trained, could fly anything with wings. Used to run charters, cargo, search and rescue flights, whatever needed flying. She was—" Ray stopped, hesitating. Vincent waited. "Was?" Ray glanced toward Mia, then lowered her voice. "Sarah died about 6 months ago. Medical flight, bad storm. She got the supplies through, but she didn't make it back." The room seemed to go still. Mia didn't flinch, didn't speak, just looked down at her sketchbook and kept working. But the weight of that truth shifted the air. Vincent felt something tighten in his chest. A pilot, a mother, gone in a storm, and this girl, this extraordinary girl, left to carry whatever legacy was left behind. "She died flying?" he asked, softer this time. "Helping people," Ray replied. "That was Sarah's whole life. She got a call about a remote clinic, children's medicine needed fast. No one else would go up in that weather, but she said, they don't have a choice, so neither do I. She delivered the meds, but the return flight—" Ray's voice caught for a moment. "She never made it home." Bobby stopped what he was doing. Tommy looked over, swallowing hard. Mia's pencil paused, hovering over the sketch. Her hand went to her necklace again, fingers lightly brushing the silver wings. Vincent stepped closer. "Those," he said, nodding to the pendant. "Those are her pilot wings, aren't they?" Mia nodded without looking up. "She wore them every time she flew," she said quietly. "Said they reminded her what the sky really meant, that it's not just about where you're going, it's about why you're flying in the first place." He stared at her, suddenly lost in his own memories. The cold weight of something he hadn't thought about in years pressed down on him. That voice, that name, Sarah Richardson. It stirred something deep and uncomfortable. A moment, a storm, a pilot, a memory that wouldn't form just yet, but hovered there like mist over frozen ground. Ray moved closer, watching Mia with a strange mixture of affection and grief. After Sarah passed, Mia started spending even more time here. She draws, listens, helps where she can. Some folks think it's not right, too much loss, too soon. But I think she's got her mother's compass. When a plane's broken, she wants to fix it. When something doesn't make sense, she wants to understand it. That's not just talent, that's purpose. Vincent didn't respond right away. His eyes were on Mia, but his mind was somewhere else, racing back through a memory he hadn't fully faced. He thought about the pendant again, the way it looked almost familiar, and a flash of something half-buried surged to the surface, not yet clear, but close. Bobby broke the silence. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, "I think we can make this work, but I'll be honest, this modification wouldn't even be possible if she hadn't pointed it out. We'd be pulling our hair out for another 6 hours chasing the wrong problem." Vincent nodded slowly. His voice came out quieter than expected. "I know." And he did, because this wasn't just a stroke of luck or a weird coincidence. This girl, this child, had walked into a high-stakes crisis with the kind of insight and calm most executives would kill for. She hadn't just solved a mechanical issue, she'd exposed a truth he hadn't been ready to see, that sometimes the most qualified person in the room isn't the one with the degree or the title or the years of experience. Sometimes it's the one carrying a legacy around their neck, with grease on their hands, and the memory of a mother who refused to let fear decide what was possible. Vincent looked around at the mechanics now working in quiet tandem, at the tools being laid out, the parts being measured, the system slowly coming back to life, and at the girl who had made it all possible. She had her mother's eyes, her mother's calm, and maybe he thought she had something else too, something that even he, with all his money and power and ambition, couldn't explain. Something he hadn't believed in, until now. No one said anything for a while after Ray spoke. The hum of tools resumed in the background, a soft symphony of focused work. But in that moment, the emotional silence weighed heavier than the snowfall building outside. Vincent stood still, the image of those silver pilot wings etched into his mind, the story of Sarah Richardson looping behind his eyes, a woman who had braved a storm to deliver medicine, a pilot who flew when no one else would, a mother who never made it home. He hadn't known her, not really. And yet, standing in that hangar, he felt her presence more than he'd felt the confidence of his own team that morning. And there was something else, something lurking just out of reach in his memory, something tied to those wings, that name, that storm. Mia hadn't said another word. She was working again, sketching more precisely now, flipping a page and redrawing the schematic of the relay system from a new angle. Her hands moved with mechanical certainty, the kind you'd expect from someone who had rebuilt these systems 100 times. But she was still just a child. Her fingers were small, her wrists delicate, and yet her posture, her discipline, belonged to someone much older, someone trained, someone who understood that precision could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Vincent watched her, watched the way she checked each detail twice, the way she glanced at Bobby's tools, then adjusted her drawing based on what was actually available, not in theory, but in reality. She was solving not just the technical challenge, but the practical one, and she was doing it with a level of calm he hadn't seen in any of the executives he'd ever worked with. When Bobby walked over to verify her diagram, he didn't dumb down his questions, didn't patronize her. He asked her what a professional would ask a peer. "You sure about the polarity tolerance on this contact?" Mia nodded. "It's 28 volts with a 5% swing allowed under load. This unit can handle up to 30.5 before tripping out. It's got room." Bobby stared for a second, then nodded and went back to prepping the soldering station. No further questions. Vincent turned to Ray, who was still nearby, watching it all with something like awe. "You said her mother was Air Force." "Top of her class," Ray said. "Did 3 tours, flew C-17S, then switched to smaller aircraft when she came home. She had that look, you know, the one people get when they've seen what the world can be at its worst and still choose to fly into it anyway. She didn't just love planes. She respected them, treated every flight like it mattered, even if it was just moving spare parts from one hangar to another. She used to say, every takeoff is a promise, every landing is a delivery on that promise." Vincent's throat tightened. He didn't know why those words hit so hard. Maybe because he understood the weight of promises. Maybe because he'd broken some himself in the name of success. Or maybe because he'd been carried once by someone just like Sarah Richardson and only now was starting to remember. "Did she train Mia?" he asked quietly. Ray gave a small, tired smile. "Not officially, but yeah. Mia was basically her shadow. would sit with her in the hangar for hours. Sarah would explain systems, point out parts, ask her questions like she was prepping her for an exam, even though she was still in kindergarten, most kids' color. Mia mapped hydraulic lines. At first we thought Sarah was just keeping her occupied, but then we realized she was preparing her, like she knew Mia would need to carry something forward. That idea hit Vincent harder than he expected. A mother training her daughter not just for fun, not just out of love, but maybe out of necessity, maybe out of foresight, maybe because she knew her time was limited. He looked at Mia again, now standing on her toes to better see the workbench, pointing to a circuit path Bobby hadn't soldered yet. She was saying something about grounding loops, about ensuring isolation from the power bus. Bobby nodded again, following her lead. She wasn't guessing, she wasn't hoping, she was teaching. And then something shifted inside Vincent, a memory snapping into place like a puzzle piece he'd been trying not to see. A flight, a storm, a voice over the intercom, calm and firm, cutting through panic. "Everyone stay buckled, we're going to ride this out. Hold tight, I've got you." A field, a crash, a woman dragging him out of wreckage, snow falling hard, a long walk through darkness, a pilot who wouldn't let him quit, even when he begged her to stop and leave him behind. Sarah Richardson, it had to be. Vincent blinked hard, trying to ground himself. Could that be true? Could this girl, the one who had just saved his business, be the daughter of the woman who had once saved his life? He didn't say anything, not yet, but his eyes went back to those wings around Mia's neck, and the memory sharpened. He remembered them, not in pictures, in person. He had seen them up close, brushing against his chest as she lifted him from the snow, and he had never forgotten the look in her eyes, fierce, focused, unshaken, eyes he now saw again in her daughter. Tommy walked over, carrying a bin of spare connectors. "Hey, Mia," he said casually. "How come you know so much about this stuff anyway? You read manuals in your sleep?" Mia smiled faintly. "My mama said manuals are just stories about how things are supposed to work, but real understanding comes from listening to what's actually happening. If something breaks, it means something's been trying to warn you for a while." "Like people?" Tommy asked, half joking. "Exactly like people," Mia said. And there it was again, that wisdom that didn't belong to someone her age. Not just technical brilliance, but emotional clarity. She wasn't just fixing a plane, she was honoring a voice that had shaped her. And that voice, Vincent now understood, had once saved his life in the freezing dark. His fingers tightened around his phone as a new message came in from Marcus. More updates, more pressure, but the urgency felt different now. The decision ahead wasn't just about business anymore. It was about recognition, about memory, about legacy, about whether or not he could finally repay a debt he'd never acknowledged, until now. He looked back at Mia, and he knew he would never see aircraft or people the same way again. Outside, the snow had begun to fall in earnest. What started as light flurries dusting the tarmac had thickened into a steady curtain of white, blurring the outlines of parked aircraft and cloaking the runway in a haze of uncertainty. Visibility dropped inch by inch. The wind, though not violent, carried a sharpness that suggested worse weather was on the horizon. Inside the hangar, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Where there had been doubt and silence an hour ago, there was now motion, deliberate, focused, urgent. Bobby moved like a man on a mission, tools laid out in surgical precision, soldering iron humming, hands steady despite the ticking clock. Tommy sorted through bins of spare electronics, pulling compatible relays and testing each one with swift, practiced movements. Mia stood between them like a conductor at the center of an orchestra, guiding, correcting, explaining. The parts that needed modification were identified, the pin alignments mapped. The custom housing for the new relay was already being shaped. They weren't just hoping anymore, they were building. Vincent stood off to the side, watching it all unfold with a strange mix of awe and disbelief. He had flown across continents, navigated hostile mergers, and clawed his way through economic downturns, but nothing in his career had ever felt quite like this. A child leading professionals through a high-stakes repair with the calm focus of someone born to the task. But time, as always, was the enemy. His phone buzzed again, Marcus reporting that the snowstorm in Chicago had delayed the boardroom meeting by 30 minutes. A gift of time, a sliver of hope. If they could get in the air by 12:30 p.m., they still had a shot. He stepped towards Mia, who was now sketching out the modified relay's grounding points. "How long until this is ready?" he asked. Mia glanced at the parts laid out before her. "If the soldering goes clean and we don't run into contact issues, maybe 40 minutes to build and install. Add 20 for system diagnostics. That's with no mistakes." Vincent nodded slowly. "And the weather?" Mia didn't look up from her notebook. "It's going to get worse before it gets better, but it won't last. The wind's wrong." Bobby looked up from the bench. "She said that earlier. Wind's coming from the southeast. Doesn't usually last long from that direction." Tommy, who had just returned from checking external conditions, chimed in. "Yeah, and I just talked to Tower. They're saying visibility's dropping fast. Might call a ground stop soon." Ray walked back into the hangar holding a portable weather tablet. "They're debating it now. If it drops below a quarter mile, they'll freeze all non-emergency traffic." Vincent didn't like what he was hearing. How long would a ground stop last? Ray shook her head. "Could be an hour, could be 5. Depends on how the system moves." He looked back at Mia, who finally met his gaze. "But you don't think it's going to stick around?" She didn't hesitate. "It's a fast-moving system. Thin. Looks worse than it is. Once it crests the ridgeline, it'll break up. 30 minutes of heavy snow, maybe 35. Then it starts to clear." Her confidence was jarring, especially coming from someone so young. But Vincent believed her. He didn't know why. Maybe it was because everything else she'd predicted so far had been spot on. Maybe it was the way she spoke, not like someone guessing, but like someone remembering. The door to the hangar burst open again, wind pushing in a gust of snow, and Janet Richardson entered, coat wrapped tight around her and worry etched deep into her face. She saw Mia immediately and made a beeline for her. "Sweetheart, I saw the forecast. We should get going before the roads ice over." Mia looked up at her grandmother, then over at the workbench where Bobby was testing the final relay. "We're almost done. Mr. Blackwood needs to fly. I want to help." Janet's expression hardened. "You've already helped more than anyone could have asked for. But this storm isn't a joke. You don't have to stay." Vincent stepped in gently. "Ma'am, I just want to say your granddaughter, she's remarkable. She found the problem, designed a workaround. If she hadn't, we'd still be guessing." Janet looked at him, eyes sharp and measuring. "And what happens after you take off, Mr. Blackwood? You get your deal, your meeting. But what about her? What does she get, aside from another reminder that she's expected to carry a world that should still be teaching her how to live in it?" Vincent wasn't sure how to answer, because she wasn't wrong. And yet, something deeper was at play here, something that didn't have to do with obligation or exploitation. Mia wasn't just helping because someone asked her. She was doing it because it was who she was. Mia spoke before he could reply. "Mama always said when people are in trouble and you have the knowledge to help, you don't look away. You help. That's what the wings mean." Her fingers traced the pendant again, and Vincent noticed how reverently she touched it, not like a necklace, like a vow. Outside, the wind howled louder. Inside, the relay was nearly complete. Bobby was sealing the housing, checking each pin with a voltmeter. "All connections solid," he said. "Voltage steady. Last check, then we mount it." Ray's radio buzzed. "All stations, be advised. Ground stop initiated. Visibility at 1/8 mile. No takeoffs or landings permitted until further notice." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Everyone froze. Bobby cursed softly. Tommy looked down. Vincent clenched his jaw. The modification was done. The jet could fly, but now they were stuck. It was like fixing a ship just as the tide pulled away. Ray tried to soften the blow. "Weather changes fast out here. Could lift in 20. Could take an hour. I'll keep pushing the tower." Mia stepped quietly toward the open hangar door, staring out into the wall of white. She stood there for a moment, utterly still, listening. Not just watching, listening, the way she'd listened to the aircraft's failing heartbeat. Then she said with total conviction, 27 minutes. Then it starts to break up. The ridge is cutting it up already. You can't see it yet, but it's happening. Ray looked at her, then down at her tablet, then back again. "You're sure?" Mia nodded. "Mama called these sucker punch storms fast and scary, but they burn out. The models don't catch them because of how the air moves around the mountains, but I can feel it." Vincent's phone buzzed one more time. Marcus again. A final message. "Meeting starts at 2:30 sharp. If you're not airborne by 1 o'clock, we're out." He looked at the clock. 11:52. Then at the storm. Then at Mia. She didn't blink. He nodded slowly. "Okay, then we wait. 27 minutes. And in that moment, everyone in the hangar understood. This wasn't about weather reports. This wasn't about aviation protocol. This was about something else entirely. Faith, instinct, experience passed down, not in textbooks, but in quiet lessons between a mother and a daughter who understood that storms were inevitable, but some storms could be outflown. And sometimes you didn't need to see the horizon to know that it was still there, just waiting for the right moment to break through. The relay sat on the workbench like a relic brought back from the edge of failure, newly reborn. It didn't look like much, just a grey metal casing with hand-adapted fittings, some soldered wires peeking out beneath a reconditioned connector housing. But everyone in the hangar knew what it represented, a fix that wasn't supposed to be possible, a repair born out of desperation, improvisation, and brilliance. Bobby inspected it with the focus of a man who knew there'd be no second chances. He pressed each terminal, verified resistance values, double-checked continuity. The multimeter responded with perfect readings, voltage stable, load tested, every connection clean. Tommy stood beside him, practically vibrating with nervous energy, ready to hand off tools before Bobby even asked. Vincent stood just behind them, arms crossed, his expensive coat dusted in hangar grit, his phone buzzing again with more updates from Marcus that he didn't bother checking. His focus was locked on the relay, on this slim lifeline that now held the fate of his business in its fragile circuits. He had seen a lot of technology in his career, signed off on hundreds of millions in research and development, but he had never seen a single component become so much more than its physical weight. The part in front of him was no longer just an emergency solution. It was proof that the impossible could bend if you had the right hands guiding it. Mia stood quietly to the side, her notebook closed now, arms at her sides, watching the final moments of her design take shape in the real world. Her eyes weren't wide with excitement, and she wasn't bouncing with joy. Her expression was one of careful calm, the same look Vincent had seen in project leads just before a product demo that could make or break their futures. Except Mia was 8, and the stakes weren't just professional. They were personal. Her mother's voice still lived in every part of this process. It guided her. It steadied her, and everyone in the hangar knew it. "Last test," Bobby said, nodding to Tommy, who handed over the bench power supply. Bobby connected the unit, watched the indicator lights come on one by one. Green, green, green. The relay clicked softly as it cycled. "That's a good sound," he muttered. "Better than good, it's consistent." Tommy leaned in. "Want me to log the readings?" "No," Bobby replied. "I want you to install it." Tommy blinked. "Me? You've been watching. You know the order. Go make it count." The young mechanic moved with sudden purpose, relay in hand, sliding beneath the aircraft's open nose cone like a diver slipping beneath water. Tools clinked softly, screws turned, connections clicked into place, and above it all, Mia's voice guided him step by step. "Careful with pin 4. Don't force the fit. Rotate it slightly and let it seat naturally. The epoxy won't hold under stress if it's misaligned. Check the tension on the bracket before you screw down the housing." From the cockpit, Bobby monitored the navigation system on his diagnostic tablet. "Navbus is picking up signal," he announced. "We've got communication with the central unit. It's powering up clean." Tommy's voice echoed faintly from under the jet. "Relays in, secured and sealed. Running final cable check now." Vincent exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. His pulse still beat hard behind his ribs, but a current of cautious optimism began to rise through the static. The storm outside still howled against the steel hangar walls, but inside, the chaos had been replaced with movement, direction, momentum. They were winning. "Powering up avionics," Bobby said. "Tommy, back out of the nose. I'm lighting it up." "Clear," came the reply. The aircraft responded almost immediately. Cockpit lights blinked to life, displays glowing softly, gauges stabilizing. One by one, the systems cycled through their startup sequences. GPS lock, altimeter check, Navcom active, autopilot initialized. The screen showed full green status bars, one after the other. No faults, no flickers, no ghosts. "She's alive," Bobby said, a touch of reverence in his voice. Vincent turned to Mia, who was watching silently, hands clasped behind her back. She met his eyes but said nothing. There was no need. Everything had worked exactly the way she said it would. She hadn't just guessed. She hadn't hoped. She knew. That's when it happened. The light overhead caught her necklace again, the chain swinging slightly as she shifted to look toward the cockpit. The silver wings gleamed just for a second, but it was enough. Enough for Vincent to freeze. He had seen those wings before, not just the shape or the style. Those wings, the tarnish pattern near the bottom left tip, the tiny indentation where one side had been slightly bent and repaired, the way the metal was polished smooth around the edges from years of wear. It hit him all at once, like a memory breaking through ice. The storm, the crash, the cold, the fear, and the pilot who had pulled him from the wreckage. Her voice, calm and determined, saying, "I've got you, we're almost there." He hadn't remembered her face in years. Trauma had a way of blurring the details, but those wings, those he had never forgotten. Mia noticed his expression shift and tilted her head. "Something wrong?" Vincent stepped forward slowly, as if approaching something sacred. He pointed to the necklace, voice barely audible. Those belong to your mom." "Yes," she said softly. "She earned them in the Air Force. She wore them every flight. She said they helped her remember why she did what she did." Vincent didn't respond right away. He just stared, the air around him thick with a realization too big to fully take in. It couldn't be coincidence. It wasn't. He knew now, beyond doubt, that the woman who had saved his life, who had dragged him through a blizzard after a crash landing in the mountains 15 years ago, was Sarah Richardson. And standing in front of him was her daughter, wearing the very wings that had glinted in the snow as she pulled him to safety. His voice broke as he spoke. "She saved me. 15 years ago, I was in a crash, mining deal, bad weather. We lost the engine, the pilot. She got me out. Walked me through a snowstorm for hours until we found a ranch. I never saw her again." Mia's eyes widened slightly. "That was you?" "She wouldn't tell me her name. I looked for her, tried to track down the flight. The company shut down a year later. I never knew who she was, not until now." Janet, who had been standing near the hangar doors, stepped forward slowly, her hand to her mouth. "That was you? The man from the emergency landing in the Bridger Mountains?" Vincent nodded. "Yes, I owe her my life." Janet's voice was thick with emotion. "Sarah talked about that flight, said she thought she'd lost you, that you were going into shock, but she kept you talking the whole way so you wouldn't pass out. She didn't care about being a hero. She just didn't want to leave anyone behind." Mia reached for the wings again, her fingers gently touching the familiar silver. She looked up at Vincent, and in her face he saw Sarah's fire, her courage, her calm, her refusal to let the world tell her what couldn't be done. "I think," Mia said barely above a whisper, "that she knew you'd come back one day." The hangar, for a long moment, was silent except for the wind and the quiet hum of the plane, now fully awake, waiting to fly. And in that silence, something shifted inside Vincent. Not just gratitude, not just memory, something deeper. A sense that the flight he was about to take, if the weather allowed, was no longer just about a deal. It was about a promise kept, a life saved being repaid not in money, not in words, but in legacy, in wings, in wisdom, in a child who had reminded him what it meant to take off when others said you were grounded. And for the first time in a very long time, Vincent Blackwood wasn't flying for business. He was flying for something far more important. The hum of the awakened jet seemed quieter now, like even the aircraft itself had paused to absorb what had just been uncovered. The modified relay sat flawlessly integrated inside its panel, the nav systems alive and stable, ready to chart a course across the storm-churned skies. But for Vincent Blackwood, time seemed to freeze around a very different moment. He stood there, not as a CEO or a man chasing a billion-dollar deal, but as someone whose past had suddenly come roaring back through the eyes of a child, and the wings she wore around her neck. The same wings that once gleamed in the freezing moonlight as a woman half frozen and bleeding dragged him through a whiteout with nothing more than sheer will and a pilot's grit. He remembered the feel of her hand gripping his arm, the steady cadence of her voice counting steps between breaths, the way she refused to stop walking when his legs failed. He had never known her name, until now. Janet stood beside Mia, her expression a mixture of astonishment and quiet grief. She had known her daughter's final years were filled with unspoken stories. Sarah never boasted, never sought recognition for the flights she took or the people she helped. But this was different. To learn that one of those rescues had saved a man who now stood before them, changed and shaken, was like watching a circle quietly close around them all. Vincent found his voice, but it came out low, choked with something unfamiliar. I spent years trying to find her. After the crash, I asked the agency for her name, but the file was sealed. I wrote letters, filed requests. They all came back with nothing, no record, no leads. Eventually, I convinced myself she'd been reassigned, or maybe she'd died. I never thought I'd see anything from that night again. And now, he looked at Mia, who held his gaze with steady eyes far older than her years. And now I'm standing in front of her daughter. Mia nodded once. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply understood. There was a stillness to her, a grace passed down in silence through years of whispered lessons beside engines and in cockpit shadows. Mama said sometimes when you help people you don't always find out what happens to them, but she believed it mattered anyway, that doing the right thing shouldn't depend on the thank you. Vincent could barely process it. His brain still operated in terms of assets, leverage, outcomes. But this wasn't a boardroom exchange. This wasn't about stakes or strategy. This was something beyond that, something profoundly human. His gaze fell again to the wings resting just below Mia's collarbone. "She wore those the night she saved me," he said quietly. "They were the last thing I saw before I blacked out. When I woke up, I was in a stranger's barn. A local family had taken me in. The woman who brought me there was gone. No name, just a pair of wings I couldn't forget." Janet stepped forward, holding a worn photograph between her fingers. "She kept this in her flight case," she said softly. The photo showed Sarah Richardson standing beside a battered King Air, smiling in front of a storm cloud backdrop. The very wings around Mia's neck were pinned above her heart in the image. She wore a heavy flight jacket and a half smirk that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing and why it mattered. "She never told us your name," Janet said. "Only that she'd helped someone who'd almost given up, that she saw something in him, said he reminded her of what she was flying for." Vincent took the photo gently. It was like touching history, and yet it wasn't history. It was here, now, in this hangar filled with snow and sparks and the hum of second chances. Everything was different now. The flight ahead no longer represented just a business milestone. It had become a continuation of something left unfinished, a chance to honor the person who saved him through the daughter she left behind. Mia was watching him carefully, and then, in a voice just above a whisper, she asked the question that had clearly been sitting inside her all along. "Do you remember being afraid?" He nodded slowly. "Yes. More afraid than I'd ever been. I thought I was going to die. I didn't care about the deal, or the money, or the plane. I just wanted to survive, and then she showed up, out of nowhere, calm, focused. She didn't talk about the storm. She talked about the stars, said they were still there, even if I couldn't see them." Mia looked down, eyes shining but dry. "She used to say that to me too. On nights when I was scared, she'd say the sky doesn't leave us. We just forget how to look through the clouds." For a moment the snow outside didn't matter. The delay didn't matter. The entire hangar felt suspended in a kind of reverent quiet, as if even time itself was listening. Then the tower's voice crackled through Ray's radio, breaking the silence. All clear at runway 27. Visibility improving. Winds shifting west. Ground stop lifted. Proceed to taxi when ready. Ray raised her eyebrows in disbelief and turned toward Mia. You said 27 minutes. Mia didn't reply. She didn't need to. Bobby looked to Vincent. Systems are ready. Jet's good to fly. You're clear to go. But Vincent didn't move. Not right away. He looked around the hangar one more time, then stepped closer to Mia and knelt just enough to be at eye level. You didn't just save my flight, he said. You've helped me remember something I forgot a long time ago. Why I started all of this. What it's supposed to be for. She tilted her head. Are you still going? He hesitated. Yes, but not just for the deal. I have something else I need to do when I get there. Mia reached into her notebook and tore out one final page. It was a simple diagram of the relay unit, annotated in her small, exact handwriting. She handed it to him. In case you need to explain it. He took it gently. I think they'll believe me when I say an 8-year-old girl saved the day. She gave a rare smile. Tell them it wasn't just me. It was my mum, too. Vincent nodded. I will. As he turned toward the waiting aircraft, his steps felt different, lighter, anchored by something more meaningful than urgency or profit. The jet wasn't just ready. He was. For the first time in years, he was about to fly not toward acquisition or power or prestige, but toward something that felt like closure, like a promise made in snow, being fulfilled in the open sky. And above it all, in the quiet heart of the hangar, Mia Richardson stood still, her mother's wings glinting softly against the fading stormlight, watching the man her mother once saved walk toward a runway she helped open, both of them about to take off in very different ways. The wheels of the Gulfstream G650 rolled slowly across the icy tarmac, cutting twin paths through the thin layer of slush still melting beneath the late storm's retreat. The snow had lessened, as Mia predicted, the sharp wind falling off into soft gusts as clouds broke open, revealing slivers of pale blue sky over the ridgeline. It was quiet now, eerily quiet, except for the soft growl of the engines and the muted rumble of tires against wet concrete. Vincent sat alone in the passenger cabin, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on nothing and everything all at once. Outside, ground crews gave the signal. The aircraft began its slow taxi to the runway. The deal was still waiting. The meeting in Chicago had been delayed again, just barely, buying him a slim chance to salvage what had once been the single most important moment of his year. But everything had changed. What was waiting on the other end of this flight no longer carried the weight it had hours ago. The numbers, the contracts, the prestige, it all seemed distant, diminished. Still important, yes, but not everything. Not after what had just unfolded in that cold Montana hangar. Vincent glanced down at the folded sketch in his lap. Mia's final drawing, her instructions on the relay adaptation. He'd tucked it into his coat pocket without thinking, but now he unfolded it carefully, studying her handwriting, the precision of it, the tiny arrows and notes that no child should have had the knowledge to include. But Mia wasn't just a child. She was the echo of a legacy. Her voice, her hands, her mind, each one carried traces of Sarah. He could feel it, and now that he knew, now that the truth had surfaced, he felt something else beneath it. Not guilt, not regret, but duty. As the jet lined up on the runway and the tower cleared them for takeoff, the captain's voice came over the intercom, confirming their flight path, thanking the ground crew, and noting that weather conditions had cleared exactly within the window predicted by unofficial forecasts. Vincent smiled faintly at that. Mia had known. No radar system had, no modeling software, just her instinct, her experience, her inheritance. As the engines roared and the jet surged forward, Vincent leaned back, the seat vibrating softly beneath him, and closed his eyes. The plane lifted into the air, climbing through the last layers of storm until clouds gave way to a crystal blue horizon. Below, the land rolled out in soft ridges and frozen creeks, but Vincent wasn't watching. His mind was already at the destination, but not the one on the ticket. He was thinking about the foundation he'd spent years promising to start, the education initiative that never left the draft phase, the STEM program he kept deferring because of timing, resources, priorities, all excuses, all things that suddenly felt irrelevant. What mattered now was finding a way to turn what Mia had done, what Sarah had done, into something bigger than a single flight. By the time the jet touched down in Chicago, Vincent had already made several decisions. He took a car directly to the meeting, arrived 12 minutes late, and walked into a room filled with tension. Lawyers stiffened in their chairs. Investors eyed their watches. But Vincent didn't apologize. He simply sat down, laid the sketch on the table without a word and said, "Before we start, I need to tell you a story." And he did. He told them about the plane failure, the storm, the child who solved a problem no one else could. He told them about the relay, the fix, the risk, and the necklace. He told them about Sarah Richardson and the night she saved his life, and the daughter who had unknowingly repaid that debt. He said nothing about being a hero, nothing about leverage, only about what it means to show up, to stay calm in the storm, to remember that the mission matters more than the credit. When he finished, the room was silent. And then, to his surprise, they didn't reject him. They leaned in, they listened, and slowly the tone shifted. The deal wasn't just signed, it was reshaped, adjusted, new terms drafted on the spot, ones that carved out space for something new, a scholarship fund, a youth innovation lab, a program dedicated to early mentorship in engineering, aviation, and crisis problem solving, not just named in Sarah Richardson's honor, built around her legacy. By the time he left that room, he wasn't just a man who'd secured his company's future. He was a man who'd begun something much greater than himself. That night, Vincent sat in a quiet Chicago office, lights low, city glowing beyond the windows. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't planned to ask for, but found himself needing. Janet answered after 3 rings. He said only one thing: "I don't want this to end with today. I want to help her go as far as she can, not just because of what she did, but because of who she is." Janet didn't speak right away, then quietly, "Sarah would have liked that." And so it began. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. A few months later, a press release announced the launch of the Richardson Flight Initiative, a partnership between Vincent's firm and several aerospace foundations. Mia became its quiet face, not because she asked to be, but because her story carried the kind of truth people couldn't ignore. She gave speeches, reluctantly at first, but always with clarity. She showed classrooms how to build relay circuits out of salvaged parts. She led simulator demonstrations where she taught high schoolers how to respond to real flight malfunctions. And everywhere she went, she wore those wings. And every time Vincent saw her, on stage, in the hangar, in workshops, he was reminded that the most important flights don't always take off from airports. Sometimes they begin when someone chooses to lift someone else, to carry a legacy forward, to fly not just higher but further. And in that truth, he found something that no deal, no contract, no power play had ever given him: a real reason to soar. 3 months later, spring rolled cautiously across Montana, still tentative beneath the chill of lingering snowdrifts. The sun hung longer in the sky, and the wind carried more warmth than frost now, sweeping across the tarmac with the scent of thawed earth and fuel. The hangar, where it had all begun, looked unchanged from the outside. Grey aluminum siding, stubborn rust around the corners, and oil-stained floors that told stories older than most of the pilots who walked across them. But inside, something was very different. Something had shifted, not just in steel and circuitry, but in spirit. The east wall, once lined with cluttered tool shelves and faded posters, now bore a new sign: the Richardson Initiative, Youth Flight and Engineering Program. Beneath it, a small plaque displayed a quote etched in brushed metal: "Every takeoff is a promise. Every landing is a delivery on that promise." Sarah's words now made permanent. Inside, a group of students ranging from age 8 to 17 stood gathered around a table where open circuitry boards, custom 3D printed components, and worn airplane manuals lay side by side. They weren't playing, they were learning, testing ideas, asking questions, and at the center of it all, with her sleeves rolled up and her familiar sketchbook under one arm, was Mia. She didn't act like a teacher, but everyone looked to her as one. She moved from station to station with quiet authority, pointing out errors without judgment, offering suggestions that helped unlock problems like a key slipping into a well-worn lock. One of the older kids, Jason, a wiry 15-year-old obsessed with drones, was arguing with a girl half his size about signal loss when Mia crouched beside them and calmly said, "It's not interference, it's your grounding loop. You've got your receiver sharing the same return as your motor controller. Reroute it, and you'll see the signal stabilize." Jason frowned, annoyed for a second, but then tried it. Seconds later, the system lit up clean and steady. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. The nod he gave her, small but respectful, said it all. Mia just smiled and moved on. She wasn't just leading the program, she was shaping it. Vincent visited often, though he stayed mostly in the background. He'd already done the press releases, the interviews, the boardroom tours. What mattered now wasn't the spotlight, it was the follow-through. He'd poured serious money into the program, enough to build scholarships, fund lab equipment, sponsor aviation summer camps, and fly in engineers and pilots from around the world to mentor these kids. But more than the money, it was the intention behind it. Every decision filtered through one core question. Would this have helped Sarah? Would this make Mia feel seen, not used? He wasn't just writing checks, he was correcting course. One afternoon, while standing by the edge of the hangar's newly converted classroom space, Vincent watched Mia explain a fluid dynamics problem to a group of students. Her hair was tied back, her jeans smudged with graphite and solder, and around her neck, as always, hung the silver wings. They'd lost a bit more shine, dulled by time and use, but that made them even more powerful. They weren't decoration, they were armor, they were memory. Janet approached from the side, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Vincent, who nodded his thanks. "She's really stepped into it, hasn't she?" he said, watching Mia pause to laugh with one of the younger kids who'd just cross-wired a light board and made the whole thing blink in Morse code. "She has," Janet said. "I worried at first. Thought maybe we were asking too much. But this place, it gives her something steady. It gives her purpose. She doesn't just see machines here, she sees possibilities." Vincent took a sip. "She's got that from her mother." Janet looked at him sideways. "You've got some of that too, whether you want to admit it or not." He didn't respond at first. Then, "I used to think I was chasing legacy, building something to be remembered by, but all I was really doing was climbing ladders with no top. It took an 8-year-old girl with a sketchbook and a relay diagram to remind me that legacies aren't built in towers. They're built in hangars like this, in classrooms, in choices." She smiled gently. Sarah always believed that. She used to say, "Don't aim to be remembered, aim to make remembering you feel worth it." Outside, another group of kids arrived. A small charter bus pulled up and a volunteer pilot stepped out, introducing himself as a guest speaker. Mia walked over to greet him. She shook his hand with the same calm she showed that day in the hangar, confident, respectful, completely unshaken by age or title. The pilot seemed surprised at first, then impressed. Moments later, they were deep in conversation about fuel ratios and engine redundancies. Vincent turned back to Janet. "Do you think she'll fly one day?" She didn't hesitate. "No doubt in my mind." He nodded, eyes on Mia again. "When she's ready, I want to make sure there's a plane waiting." Janet smiled. "You won't have to wait long." And she was right, because Mia was already flying, just not with wings yet. She was lifting others, carrying pieces of her mother forward, teaching with the same fire, the same clarity, the same refusal to give up on people when they didn't understand something the first time or the 5th. Every time a student succeeded, Mia celebrated quietly and moved on to the next. Every failure was treated not as a wall, but as a question that hadn't been phrased the right way yet. And so the initiative grew, so did Mia, and so did Vincent. He began showing up at other hangars, quietly funding STEM projects in places that had been ignored. He met with veteran pilots, mechanics, instructors, asking them what they needed to make space for the next generation. He sat on the floor during student presentations, asked questions, took notes. He wasn't building empires anymore. He was building runways, and somewhere in all of it, he stopped chasing his old version of success, because now, every time he saw Mia guide a new student or explain an idea that helped someone finally get it, he felt something deeper than accomplishment. He felt a scent, not his, hers, and that made all the difference.